Welcome to Games from Folktales, a podcast that mixes historical research and tabletop role-playing settings. I'm your host, Timothy Ferguson, and this week we continue our quest through Elfland in The King of Elfland's Daughter. What follows are two chapters from the LibriVox recording by Michelle Fry, thanks to Michelle and all of her production team, and I'll be popping up during the recording to give the folkloristic angle on the things mentioned. Over to Michelle.
Chapter 4. Alfric comes back to Earth after many years. Back through the guarding wood went Alveric and Lyrazel, she only looking once more at those flowers and lawns, seen only by the furthest travelling fancies of poets in deepest sleep, then urging Alveric on, he choosing the way past trees he had disenchanted. And she would not let him delay even to choose his path, but kept urging him away from the palace that is only told of in song. And the other trees began to come lumbering towards them from beyond the lustreless, unromantic line that Alveric's sword had smitten, looking queerly as they came at their stricken comrades, whose listless branches drooped without magic or mystery. And as the moving trees came nearer, Lyrazel would hold up her hand, and they all halted and came on no more. And still she urged upon Alveric to hasten.
So here we have proof that the trees are conscious actors rather than puppets, because they stop and look at their disenchanted comrades. Note that they obey Lyrazel.
She knew her father would climb the brazen stairs of one of those silver spires. She knew he would soon come out onto the high balcony. She knew what rune he would chant. She heard the sound of his footsteps ascending, ringing now through the wood. They fled over the plain beyond the wood, all through the blue, everlasting elfin day, and again she looked over her shoulder and urged Alveric on. The elf king's feet boomed slow on the thousand brazen steps, and she hoped to reach the barrier of twilight, which on that side was smoky and dull, when suddenly, as she looked for the 100th time at the distant balconies of the glittering spires, she saw a door begin to open high up above the palace only told of in song. She cried, "Alas!" to Alveric.
Lyrazel seems to be able to see to extreme distances, but only when it's important to the plot. This could be an example of the fairy sympathy that we've seen displayed by other inhabitants of Elfland in this story.
But at that moment the scent of briar roses came drifting to them from the fields we know. Alveric knew not fatigue, for he was young, nor she, for she was ageless. They rushed forward, he taking her hand. The elf king lifted his beard, and just as he began to intone a rune that only once may be uttered, against which nothing from our fields can avail, they were through the frontier of twilight, and the rune shook and troubled those lands in which Lyrazel walked no longer.
In game terms, they are now beyond the range of the rune.
When Lyrazel looked upon the fields we know, as strange to her as once they have been to us, their beauty delighted her. She laughed to see the haystacks, and loved their quaintness.
In Fairyland there is no winter, therefore there's no need to put up fodder for animals for the winter, so there are no haystacks.
A lark was singing, and Lyrazel spoke to it, and the lark seemed not to understand.
To quote Sondheim, "You can talk to birds."
But she turned to other glories of our fields, for all were new to her, and forgot the lark. It was curiously no longer the season of bluebells, for all the foxgloves were blooming, and the May was gone, and the wild roses were there. Alveric never understood this.
Foxgloves are yet another fairy plant. The name does lead to stories of foxes using the flowers as gloves, but one theory is that it comes from a Saxon word, gliau, which means a ring of bells. The foxes were taught by the fair folk to ring the bells to warn their fellows that a hunt was nearby. There are some problems with this theory, the key one being that fox hunting only became popular once the English had killed off anything larger and more edible. Foxglove lore varies across England. In some areas, the flowers are believed to grow on mounds favoured by the fairies. In others, if the stalks of the foxglove are moving, but there is no wind, fairies are passing by. In some areas, it attracts them to gardens, and in others, foxglove petals protect children from abduction. The use of foxglove as a heart medicine and, relatedly, as a poison is known in period.
It was the early morning, and the sun was shining, giving soft colors to our fields, and Lirazel rejoiced in those fields of ours at more common things than one might believe there were amongst the familiar sights of earth's every day. So glad was she, so gay, with her cries of surprise and her laughter, that there seemed thenceforth to Alvaric a beauty that he had never dreamed of in buttercups, and a humor in carts that he never had thought of before. Each moment she found with a cry of joyous discovery some treasure of earth's that he had not known to be fair. And then, as he watched her bringing a beauty to our fields, more delicate even than the wild roses brought, he saw that her crown of ice had melted away.
Buttercups are likely a time marker here. There's not a great deal of folklore about them, so they differ from the other flowers which have been discussed elsewhere in this podcast. I find that the flowers I call buttercups are completely different from the ones which are discussed in this story. As to the melting of her crown of ice, it's because she's lost her role as princess.
And thus she came from the palace that may only be told of in song, over the fields of which I need not tell, for they were the familiar fields of earth, that the ages change but little, and only for a while, and came at evening with Alvaric to his home. All was changed in the castle of Earl. In the gateway they met a guardian whom Alvaric knew. The man wondered to see them. In the hall and upon the stairway they met some that tended the castle, who turned their heads in surprise. Alvaric knew them also, but all were older, and he saw that quite 10 years must have passed away during that one blue day he had spent in Elfland. Who does not know that this is the way of Elfland? And yet who would not be surprised if they saw it happen as Alvaric saw it now? He turned to Lirazel and told her how 10 or 12 years were gone. But it was as though a humble man who had wed an earthly princess should tell her he had lost sixpence. Time had no value or meaning to Lirazel, and she was untroubled to hear of the 10 lost years. She did not dream what time means to us here.
She doesn't understand time. This is the first note we get that indicates Lirazel is congenitally unable to understand human things.
They told Alvaric that his father was long since dead, and one told him how he died happy, without impatience, trusting to Alvaric to accomplish his bidding, for he had known somewhat of the ways of Elfland, and he knew that those that traffic twixt here and there must have something of that calm in which Elfland forever dreams.
As noted in an earlier episode, the king may be able to foretell the future, which may have given him some assurance that all would be well.
Up the valley, ringing late, they heard the blacksmith's work. This blacksmith was he who had been the spokesman of all those who went once to the long red room to the Lord of Earl. And all these men yet lived, for time, though it moved over the vale of Earl, as over all fields we know, moved gently, not as in our cities.
In Ars Magica terms, that's a positive aging modifier due to environment.
Thence Alvaric and Lirazel went to the holy place of the friar, and when they found him, Alvaric asked the friar to wed them with Christum rites.
Assuming that this is a friar, it places the story as later than the foundation of the mendicant orders, which was in the 12th century. Christum is an archaic form of the word chrism and refers to the anointing of the chosen. We can take it as Christian for all effective purposes.
And when the friar saw the beauty of Lirazel flash mid the common things in his little holy place, for he had ornamented the walls of his house with knick-knacks that he sometimes bought at the fairs, he feared at once she was of no mortal line. And when he asked her whence she came, and she happily answered, Elfland, the good man clasped his hands and told her earnestly how all in that land dwelt beyond salvation. But she smiled, for while in Elfland she had always been idly happy, and now she only cared for Alvaric. The friar went then to his books to see what should be done.
Here we come to a matter that's of interest even in modern theology. Are things other than humans saved? The current Vatican position, as described by the Vatican's astronomer, Guy Consolmagno, is that if there are tentacled Lovecraftian monsters in space, they can be baptized if they want to be. They don't get their own squid Jesus, however. The Son of God doesn't need to tour the universe getting repeatedly nailed to sticks. The medieval belief concerning the salvation of fairies was a bit more complicated, because fairy is a category we use to group all kinds of unrelated things together.
For a long while he read in silence but for his breathing, while Alvaric and Lirazel stood before him. And at last he found in his book a form of service for the wedding of a mermaid that had forsaken the sea, though the good book told not of Elfland. And this, he said, would suffice, for that the mermaids dwelt equally with the elf folk beyond thought of salvation. So he sent for his bell and such tapers as are necessary. Then, turning to Lirazel, he bade her forsake and forswear, and solemnly to renounce all things pertaining to Elfland, reading slowly out of a book the words to be used on this wholesome occasion. "Good friar," Lirazel answered, "naught said in these fields can cross the barrier of Elfland, and well that this is so, for my father has 3 runes that could bless this book when he answered one of its spells, were any word able to pass through the frontier of twilight. I will spell no spells with my father." "But I cannot wed, Christian man," the friar replied, "with one of the stubborn who dwell beyond salvation." Then Alvaric implored her, and she said the say in the book. "Though my father could bless this spell," she added, "if it ever crossed one of his runes." And the bell being now brought, and the tapers, the good man wedded them in his little house with the rites that are proper for the wedding of a mermaid that hath forsaken the sea.
Lirazel here reaches the secular standard for marriage, but in a religious sense she's not reaching the required understanding to be married here. It's pretty clear she does not understand the nature of the sacrament and is just repeating words because it pleases Alvaric. The priest should stop here in theory, but the role of consent in marriage is sometimes not well enforced by the Church.
Chapter 5. The Wisdom of the Parliament of Erle. In those bridal days the men of Erle came often to the castle, bringing gifts and felicitations, and in the evenings they would talk in their houses of the fair things that they hoped for the Vale of Erle, on account of the wisdom of the thing they had done, when they spoke with the old lord in his long red room. There was Gnarl the blacksmith, who had been their leader. There was Guhick, who first had thought of it after speaking with his wife, an upland farmer of clover pastures near Erle. There was Nehick, a driver of horses. There were 4 vendors of beeves, or cattle, and Oth, a hunter of deer, and Vlel, the master ploughman. All these and 3 men more had gone to the Lord of Erle and made that request that had set Alvaric on his wanderings. And now they spoke of all the good that would come of it. They had all desired that the Vale of Erle should be known among men, as was, they felt, its desert. They had looked in histories, they had read books treating of pastures, yet seldom found mention at all of the vale they loved. And one day Guhick had said, "Let all us people be ruled in the future by a magic lord, and he shall make the name of the valley famous, and there shall be none that have heard not of the name of Erle."
Michelle cheekily breaks the LibriVox rules there by adding the note that beeves are cattle. Beeves is the plural of beef. The habit of the men going to one man's house to drink rather than to a tavern is normal in the 13th century. Taverns are for areas where people travel or there's a lot of leftover grain. The people of Erle drink mead, which is made of fermented clover honey, instead.
And all had rejoiced, and had made a parliament, and it had gone 12 men to the Lord of Erle, and it had been as I have told. So now they spoke over their mead of the future of Erle, and its place among other valleys, and of the reputation that it should have in the world. They would meet and talk in the great forge of Gnarl, and Gnarl would bring them mead from an inner room, and Threll would come in late from his work in the woods. The mead was of clover honey, heavy and sweet, and when they had sat a while in the warm room, talking of daily things of the valley and uplands, they would turn their minds to the future, seeing as through a golden mist the glory of Earl. One praised the beeves, another the horses, another the good soil, and all looked to the time when other lands should know the great mastery among valleys that was held by the valley of Earl. And time that brought these evenings bore them away, moving over the vale of Earl as over all fields we know, and it was spring again and the season of bluebells. And one day in the prime of the wild anemones it was told that Alveric and Lirazel had a son. Then all the people of Earl lit a fire next night on the hill, and danced about it, and drank mead, and rejoiced. All day they had dragged logs and branches from it from the wildwood near, and the glow of the fire was seen in other lands. Only on the pale blue peaks of the mountains of Elfland no gleam of it shone, for they are unchanged by aught that can happen here. And when they rested from dancing round their fires, they would sit on the ground and foretell the fortune of Earl, when it should be ruled over by this son of Alveric, with all the magic he would have from his mother. And some said he would lead them to war, and some said to deeper ploughing, and all foretold a better price for their beeves. None slept that night for dancing and foretelling a glorious future, and for rejoicing at the things they foretold. And above all they rejoiced that the name of Earl should be thenceforth known and honored in other lands.
Deeper ploughing increases crop yields by changing the water retention characteristics of soil. There's a reaction against it in the modern day because it causes topsoil loss, but that was, of course, unknown to the medieval men of Earl.
Then Alveric sought for a nurse for his child, all through the valley and uplands, and not easily found any worthy of having the care of one that was of the royal line of Elfland, and those that he found were frightened of the light, as though not of our earth or sky, that seemed to shine at times in the baby's eyes.
This is the fairy eyes virtue as part of the strong fairy blood package.
And in the end he went one windy morning up the hill of the lonely witch, and found her sitting idly in her doorway, having nothing to curse or bless. "Well," said the witch, "did the sword bring you fortune?" "Who knows," said Alveric, "what brings fortune, since we cannot see the end?" And he spoke wearily, for he was weary with age, and never knew how many years had gone over him on the day he travelled to Elfland, far more, it seemed, than had passed on that same day over Earl.
He's either suffered some sort of long-term fatigue or suffered an aging crisis.
"Ay," said the witch, "who knows the end but we?" "Mother Witch," said Alveric, "I wedded the king of Elfland's daughter." "That was a great advancement," said the old witch. "Mother Witch," said Alveric, "we have a child, and who shall care for him?" "No human task," said the witch. "Mother Witch," said Alveric, "will you come to the Vale of Earl, and care for him, and be the nurse at the castle? For none but you in all these fields knows aught of the things of Elfland, except the princess, and she knows nothing of earth." And the old witch answered, "For the sake of the king, I will come." So the witch came down from the hill with a bundle of queer belongings, and thus the child was nursed in the fields we know by one who knew songs and tales of his mother's country.
And she's back. Jason Tondoro from the forums has done a great set of statistics for the witch. I have to get his permission to use them on this site.
And often, as they bent together over the baby, that aged witch and the Princess Lirazel would talk together, and afterwards through long evenings, of things about which Alveric knew nothing, and for all the age of the witch, and the wisdom that she had stored in her 100 years, which is all hidden from man, it was nevertheless she who learned when they talked together, and the Princess Lirazel who taught. But of earth and the ways of earth, Lirazel never knew anything.
Lirazel cannot learn folklore, but the witch is gaining fairy lore by exposure.
And this old witch that watched over the baby so tended him and so soothed that in all his infancy he never wept.
Fairy children are often described as having a sort of insular calm. There is some thought behind the idea that many changeling children were actually on the autistic spectrum, and the charms used against them are a sort of ableism that forces masking.
For she had a charm for brightening the morning, and a charm for cheering the day, and a charm for calming a cough, and a charm for making the nursery warm and pleasant and eerie, when the fire leaped up at the sound of it from logs that she had enchanted, and sent large shadows of the things about the fire quivering dark and merry over the ceiling. And the child was cared for by Lirazel and the witch, as children are cared for whose mothers are merely human. But he knew tunes and runes besides that other children hear not in fields we know.
So he's raised as an enchanter and a spellcaster, and teaching that by exposure to small children is often a really bad idea, which is why the Order of Hermes doesn't do it.
So the old witch moved about the nursery with her black stick, guarding the child with her runes. If a draught on windy nights shrilled in through some crack, she had a spell to calm it, and a spell to charm the song that the kettle sang, till its melody brought hints of strange news from mist-hidden places, and the child grew to know the mystery of far valleys that his eyes had never seen.
For Magonomia players, her general divination is triggered by boiling a kettle. Does she make a good cup of tea? You know she does.
And at evening she would raise her ebon stick, and standing before the fire amongst all the shadows, would enchant them and make them dance for him. And they took all manner of shapes of good and evil, dancing to please the baby, so that he came to have knowledge not only of the things with which earth is stored, pigs, trees, camels, crocodiles, wolves and ducks, good dogs and the gentle cow, but of the darker things also that men have feared, and the things they have hoped and guessed. Through those evenings the things that happen and the creatures that are passed over those nursery walls, and he grew familiar with the fields we know. And on warm afternoons the witch would carry him through the village, and all the dogs would bark at her eerie figure, but durst not come too close, for a page boy behind her carried the ebon stick.
She has the gift, or at least the offensive to animals law. In Michelle Fry's reading, we see an interesting quirk of the English language, and that she goes from referring to it as the ebon stick to the ebon stick. This change in emphasis from the noun to the adjectival part is found in English as things become more familiar. So in some old Cary Grant movies, you hear of him talking about Boy Scouts rather than Boy Scouts. You hear them talking about Girl Scout cookies rather than Girl Scout cookies. Once things become more familiar, the adjective becomes the point of stress.
And dogs that know so much, that know how far a man can throw a stone, and if he would beat them, and if he durst not, knew also that this was no ordinary stick.
So let's assume it's real ebony then. Ebony has a natural shine, is very hard, and sinks in water.
So they kept far away from that queer black stick in the hand of the page, and snarled, and the villagers came out to see. And all were glad when they saw how magical a nurse the young heir had, for here, they said, is the witch Zerundarel, and they declared that she would bring him up amongst the true principles of wizardry, and that in his time there would be magic that would make all their valley famous. And they beat their dogs until they slunk indoors, but the dogs clung to their suspicions still. So that when the men were gone to the forge of Gnarl, and their houses were quiet in the moonlight, and Gnarl's windows glowed, and the mead had gone round, and they talked of the future of Earl, more and more voices joining in the tale of its coming glory, on soft feet the dogs would come out to the sandy street and howl. And to the high sunny nursery Lirazel would come, bringing a brightness that the learned witch had not in all her spells, and would sing to her boy those songs that none can sing to us here, for they were learned the other side of the frontier of twilight, and were made by singers all unvexed by time. And for all the marvel that there was in those songs, whose origin was so far from the fields we know, and in times remote from those that historians use, and though men wondered at the strangeness of them, when from open casements through the summer days they drifted over Earl, yet none wondered even at those, as she wondered at the earthly ways of her child, and all the little human things that he did more and more as he grew. For all human ways were strange to her. And yet she loved him more than her father's realm, or the glittering centuries of her ageless youth, or the palace that may be told of only in song. In those days Alvaric learned that she would never now grow familiar with earthly things, never understand the folk that dwelt in the valley, never read wise books without laughter, never care for earthly ways, never feel more at ease in the castle of Earl than any woodland thing that Thrall might have snared and kept caged in a house. He had hoped that soon she would learn the things that were strange to her, till the little differences that there are between things in our fields and in Elfland should not trouble her any more. But he saw at last that the things that were strange would always remain so, and that all the centuries of her timeless home had not so lightly shaped her thoughts and fancies that they could be altered by our brief years here. When he had learned this, he had learned the truth.
In a human, this would be the raised by fairies flaw.
Between the spirits of Alvaric and Lirazel lay all the distance there is between earth and Elfland, and love bridged the distance which can bridge further than that. Yet when for a moment on the golden bridge he would pause and let his thoughts look down at the gulf, all his mind would grow giddy, and Alvaric trembled. What of the end, he thought, and feared lest it should be stranger than the beginning. And she did not see that she should know anything. Was not her beauty enough? Had not a lover come at last to those lawns that shone by the palace only told of in song, and rescued her from her uncompanioned fate, and from that perpetual calm? Was it not enough that he had come? Must she needs understand the curious things folk did? Must she never dance in the road, never speak to goats, never laugh at funerals, never sing at night? Why? What was joy for, if it must be hidden? Must merriment bow to dullness in these strange fields she had come to? And then one day she saw how a woman of Earl looked less fair than she had looked a year ago. Little enough was the change, but her swift eye saw it surely. And she went to Alvaric crying to be comforted, because she feared that time in the fields we know might have power to harm that beauty that the long, long ages of Elfland had never dared to dim. And Alvaric had said that time must have his way, as all men know, and where was the good of complaining?
It's easy to feel sorry for Lirazel here. She's just discovered she's mortal, theoretically. It's her potential for mortality which has spurred her father to his various acts that seem like imprisonment. There are hints he's not quite Fey in origin himself. He may have undergone the mystery of becoming. And now, as the black cat approaches in the background to tell me that I am done for the evening, we'll leave the Kingdom of Earl for this week. Your saga may vary.